So, by way of introduction, I had a magazine that Stella Adler gave me after I started teaching. This was in the 80s. And in 2010, I read an article, and it was by Professor Sharon Carnicke. And I found earlier today, I found an email I sent to her on the 29th of June, 2010, that says, "Is it possible you're the person who wrote the extraordinarily fascinating article An Actor Prepares?" So she wrote me back and said that she, in fact, was that Sharon Carnegie. And then about a month later, I got an email from her dated July 21st, 2010. "Dear Milton, aren't you interviewed in the documentary about Stella Adler, Awake and Seeing? I just realized that I share clips from that with my students every year. I'm looking forward to meeting you when classes start in the fall." So Sharon Carnegie and I have been meeting regularly since 2010, apparently. And we now have lengthy conversations about acting at all times. I think she's a gift. I feel like she's done all the work I don't have to do, like learn Russian and translate it. So here's the thing. A conversation about method acting is an interesting question because I think what has happened is all of a sudden people are talking about method acting and not necessarily positively. And I think it would be an interesting discussion of just what is method acting. Most recently, of course, I guess the most publicity. Obviously, he's edging himself towards an Emmy Award nomination. Is the actor on Succession, and one lead actor said he was so sick and tired of method acting because apparently this other actor has this method acting thing where he lives the character 24 hours a day. Um, and Sharon and I have had this discussion as she drives to work about when did that become method acting? What are your thoughts on that, Sharon?
Mhm. Well, starting there, are we? Okay. First of all, let me say welcome to everybody. And I actually asked this question of another colleague of mine who had studied at the Actors Studio, who's here today, Laura James. So, welcome, Laura, as well. I just want to say that, first of all, there is no single method. The method, just a little bit of history. The method began when Stella Adler challenged Strasberg on his understanding of Stanislavski, 1934. And she came back from having met Stanislavski and said that she learned some other things that he wasn't teaching. And he got very angry. And the next day he called another meeting and he said, the thing is, I don't teach the Stanislavski system. I teach the Strasberg method, and the method as a term has stuck. So we have this word, the method, but everybody who teaches acting who is related to that period and calls themselves part of the method all teach differently. So that's what I want to start by telling everybody in the room, that there are so many different ways into the method that there's no one single way. And yet the word won't go away. And sometimes reviewers use it, and star studies people use it to just talk about sort of any actor who is using any kind of process that may or may not work for them. And so we are all in a confusion of terms, and a single term that means so many things and different things to other people. I think I'd just start there, if I might, and maybe add one other thing to the mix, if you will, if you don't mind, Milton,
Of
if I
course.
go back to a Russian word, Pirizhevanya, one of your favorites. What Stanislavski said is that there were lots of ways to act, and all of them were valid if they helped the actor. So I really think that there's no one right way. There's no one right way. We have to look at pragmatically what works for every single actor. But what he did say is that he had an ideal of acting in his head that he wanted to strive for. And he put a name on it. He called it переживание, which is a Russian word that's hard to translate. But I translate it as experiencing. And when I read what he says about it, this is what he wants from the actor. He wants an actor to be so absorbed in their role and in the performance of that role, the reality of performing in front of a camera, on a stage, with your partners, with everything that surrounds you, wearing the costume you wear, within the script that you are working. He wants you to feel so absorbed that all the technique that you've studied feels somehow easy, like it all falls into place. It's that wonderful moment when we feel like everything is working right and we're in what something like more modern psychologists call flow. And that for him was the best kind of acting, and he called it experiencing because he wanted the actor to experience the role as a performance in every which way, from your hair down to your fingertips. And however you get there is his system, all the little bits and pieces that he put together to help the actor pragmatically. I'm gonna end my little intro to you, Milton, with something as well, because one of the reasons I love talking with acting about acting with you specifically, Milton, is the fact that coming out of working with Stella Adler, you have learned the pragmatics of what Stanislavski is really looking for, because everything that works for the actor is the best thing. And I love the fact that when we met, you picked up stuff from my work that you now use in your teaching. Like the word problem when we talked about it way back when, right? And I love that flexibility because I think that's exactly what it was that Stanislavski wanted from people who are helping actors learn to act better. So I know that's not directly an answer to the specific question you asked, but I thought it might be a kind of bigger overview to just get some questions from the audience going so that we can do what we do so well, which is talk about acting.
About acting. I think it's in the article I read, you said you thought one of the most
Perezhevania, yes. Don't learn Russian yet.
I know. We all have to learn that word. But I thought it was important because certainly it was one of the things Stella Adler had taught us. And that the most important thing was experiencing. And what she had said, which is interesting because I happened to find it in your book, that facts are death to the actor unless they're fed through the imagination and become the experience of facts. And I thought that was important because it helps us realize that when we're, as actors, answering questions, when somebody says, where does the play take place? The answer to the question is not, you're not reporting. Oh, it takes place in New York. Finished. Go on. And for me, I think if you develop the ability to answer every question about the part as the experience of that answer, then all of a sudden the fact that you say, New York, means something. And nothing is just a grocery list of facts that don't affect you. And I think that's kind of the great thing that I've sort of picked up in our years together talking about it, is how extraordinarily useful it is when you translate the facts into the experience of the facts, because you begin to you begin to kind of create a world that exists that you kind of step into as the character. Anyway, I love that. I love that word. And of course, the other word I loved was Zadacha, which I just think is the greatest. Which, for those of you who haven't read Sharon's book or my book, um, one of the reasons I was drawn to her is because she brought up the fact that Zadacha was the mistranslated as objective, when the actual translation of it is problem. And I thought, oh my God, I've never liked the word objective. Objective sounded like one of those words like, what's your objective? My objective is to be a good actor. I may or may not achieve it. But a word like problem seemed to me to be one of those things that you could not easily, but you could latch on to when you're working on a character. Trying to come up with a character's problem seems to me to be so much more logical than trying to come up with the character's objective. And I loved that. And I felt like I died and gone to heaven. When all of a sudden I went, yes, this is it.
Yeah, in Russian, it means it's a word that could be translated a lot of different ways. But when Stanislavski talks about it in his book, he says that an actor is presented with a zadacha the same in every scene that they're in the same way that a math teacher presents a student with a zadacha to solve, and your action is what you use to solve it. So when I read that, how else could you translate zadacha? It makes perfect sense to translate it as problem, because just like a math problem that you have to go about solving, a scene gives your character a problem that you have to go about solving with your action. Very simple.
Well,
and also I just throw in. I don't like the word, and I wish we could come up with a different one. But I mean, one of the British people, maybe it's Declan Donovan, uses the word tactics, and it's not my favorite word, but it does hit me that if I have a problem and I'm trying to solve it, as I have obstacles, I have to change the way that I solve it, which then gives colors to the actions.
Correct.
And it helps you. In my mind, it helps you your partner, whether the partner is maybe the location or an actual physical partner, helps you because you need them in order to respond. And I agree with you. It's simplified acting, which I know is a ludicrous thing to do.
Well, just to chime in here about Zadacha, one thing, I think for me, the biggest revelation about that was it freed me from this vocabulary trap, and it made it more real. It made it more immediate.
Well, that was the other thing. That was the other thing Sharon's article pointed out, is that Stanislavski was never looking for a vocabulary. In fact, on my book, they asked me, what do you want for the cover of the book? And I said, well, in my mind, if it were this century, Stanislavski and Stella would be texting each other. And so I'd love Stella at a computer. And the first thing Stella Adler ever said to Stanislavski was, "You've made me hate acting." And so I called Sharon and I said, so now they like the idea, but they want to know what Stanislavski would have said. And so she said, well, I don't know what Stanislavski said to Stella Adler, but I do know he said to Josh Logan, when he said he was confused about it, Stanislavski said to him, "Oh, I see you've read my books," which is what I used as his response. But I think that is I find that important because I do think we evolve a process um, that is not set in stone. It's like you were saying earlier. It's like different things work, and the fact, and it's really frustrating. But the fact that something works for you this time doesn't mean it's going to work next time. And also because we're different people, um, we're going to approach the part differently.
Yes, speaking of that, I mean, and that we just got this question from Anthony Sestaro, who's asking, what would you say are the biggest misconceptions, misunderstandings, misinterpretations about Stanislavski's teaching? And this is a big one. I mean, when stars talk about their process, they either don't have one, so they limit what they're saying to what works for them, but doesn't work for everybody else necessarily, or they don't have a clear idea of what they do. But it's always the notion of using yourself. It gets so much attention because it's so extreme. And then people think,
I'd
well,
like
if
to
it's
speak.
good enough for Julia Roberts, it's good enough for me. So
Well, I like to speak to that, Walker, because the
please.
question is a great one, and I'm actually seeing it up on my screen here. What would you say the biggest areas of misunderstanding about Stanislavski's teaching is? And I'd like to just address it in a big way. First of all, the method which talks about personal substitution and using your personal emotion is not Stanislavski. Stanislavski played with that early in his career, but he threw it out because he realized that it destabilized the mental health of his actors. When one of his best actors, Michael Chekhov, had a nervous breakdown at his first studio, this was around 1911 when Stanislavski was first working on the system and trying and experimenting with emotional recall. Stanislavski was shaken to his bones that because one of his best actors had a mental breakdown because of the work. And he paid for the psychiatric bills for Michael Chekhov in that instance. And then he never, ever expected actors to use their own personal work if they could use their imagination and empathy. When actors asked him, how do I work on my emotional memory? He used to say, go to museums, read novels, read history, read everything you can get your hands on, stay on top of current events, because the more you know about the world, the more empathetic you are as a person, and the more you can have empathy for the characters you play. And when he teaches a kind of emotional memory recall exercise that I teach in my own work, which is based in yoga visualization, he never insists that actors use personal images. If they do, it's up to them. But he was always, in his own words, concerned about the mental hygiene of his actors. So this is the first thing that I think distinguishes what happened to the Stanislavski system in the United States, where the idea of using yourself became an idea that you have to use your own personal trauma to quote another big acting book that's out there. I won't mention the author right now. But it's not true that Stanislavski asked actors to use their personal trauma. He asked them to use their imaginations. And of course, because we are standing on a stage in a flesh and blood way, and we are working with flesh and blood people across from us, whether it's on a stage or on a sound set with cameras, it doesn't matter. We are there. That is all he means by using yourself. You have to be absolutely present in the performance at every moment. That's the Pirajivanya. That's the experiencing that he wants. But it doesn't have to be personal. Empathy is the key. And yes, I saw that, Victoria K. Empathy is the key. Thank you. I really think that's the beginnings of the misunderstandings. Beyond that, we can talk about words, terms that get confused. We can talk about anything you want to talk. But the biggest issue is Stanislavski was always, always grounded in the text, in imagination, in the possibilities of art, because he saw us as artists. And he did not think that realism alone was the way to art. Any style we work in, a musical, an action flick working with CGI now, any style that you work in is can be supported by this work. Not only naturalism and realism, which is also another misunderstanding, because people often think that the method is about authenticity and reality and that sort of thing. The Stanislavski is all about the art of what we love to do as actors, bringing other worlds, whether they're imagined, science fiction, surrealistic, realistic, to make our audiences feel that they understand our characters and can cry with us and laugh with us and share our joys.
Another thing I just want to throw in, because it happened in my class the other day. One of the actresses who asked the question, "What is so wrong with using your life?" And I said to her, "Well, in this next exercise, try it. I mean, see what happens."
Can
What
I
happened?
add an anecdote to that, if I may, because I don't want to
Sure.
forget it. It was a Russian actor of mine, an actor friend of mine, who was trained in Moscow by Maria Knebel, who's part of this book that you mentioned, the new book. She asked me, what do people do who study the method? So I told her about personal substitution and using your own life. And she laughed and she said, "Oh, I used to do that when I was first starting acting. That's what every actor does before they get a technique."
I suppose that's true. But the
I
thing
just share that because she thought it was the easy way out. And I don't know that it is, because it can destabilize you.
well,
But I just share that anecdote for what it's worth.
I find it. I mean, what happened in my class was that the actress lost control, which is a problem.
Yeah.
Somebody once asked me why the method has such a bad rep, and mostly it's because I think in film the air quotes method actors needed time to prepare, and nobody wanted that kind of time spent. I don't need you to prepare. We're shooting here. But I do think that losing control was really an issue. I think it
Yes,
was.
it was in the
I think
first
it's really a
studio.
problem.
That's what happened, and that's what he noticed in the first studio when he was playing with it and then gave it away. But one of the things that I found interesting when I came out here to Los Angeles from New York and really started working with film acting more and more is that I noticed that Strasberg, in his teaching, actually taught that it's not the actor's job to have the action or to know the action, because in film it's the director's job. So he actually taught actors to give away that agency, and I don't think that that's a positive thing, to give that away. One should have control over one's art. One should collaborate as an actor. We always are collaborating, but to give away control means to put yourself at the mercy of others, and that helps us lose control.
With
I hope that
Completely,
makes sense.
completely.
the
And
fact that Stanislavski felt so bad that he paid the psychiatric bills for this actor, I think illustrates that if the actor's out of control, it's the audience becomes then worried about you, the actor, and it takes them out of it, right?
I just noticed Joelle's note here on the chat saying that this leads to the self-indulgence of actors. So actors are feeling their own emotions rather than trying to get to convey the character's emotions, and that can lead to self-indulgence.
well, also, Sharon, I think I dumped all over, and I love her as an actress. Audra McDonald, an interview she had in the New York Times the other day, and I dumped all over her for saying, because what she said was that she looked at what she would do in that circumstance. And I think that's a very, very subtle thing. I know Bobby Lewis said it, and I thought, what are you talking about? You would never be in this circumstance. And so the fact that you were trying to figure out what you would do in that circumstance is once again pulling the play down to you, rather than lifting up to the size of the play. But that to me was always, there's subtle things that I have found are very dangerous that get in the way of actors. And I think anytime an actor says, what would I do in that circumstance, it's subtly going down that road to limit the imagination and the experience of what you would do. What would I do if I were King of England? Well,
So what kinds of questions are we still getting, Walker? Where should we go next on our journey?
would it be better for actor to pick and choose from multiple acting techniques to create a custom blend that works for them, or adhere to one specifically?
I say absolutely. I think that that's exactly what Stanislavski did. One of the things that drives me mad is when people teach the Stanislavski system as if there's a finite number in it, like, oh, you have to have, 12 points of this and 13 points of that and 101 techniques of this. The system for him was simply anything that helps the actor work better. And it was a compendium of tools that he picked up from studying yoga, from looking at actors that were surrounding him, from looking at Isadora Duncan's modern dance and bringing dancers in, and bringing in vocal work. And I think that every actor is so unique, an artist, that they will pick and choose the tools that work the best for them. And I think the key advice I would give when picking and choosing is making sure that they make sense to you. I really try to teach my students to have agency, to walk into an acting class, and if it doesn't make sense to you or doesn't feel safe, don't take it on yourself. Don't think, oh, I'm a bad actor because I can't do it the way this teacher is teaching it. Walk out and go find a different teacher who makes more sense to you, and then put it together in your own way. Take somebody like Jack Nicholson. He studied a multiple number of techniques and methods, and then he put them together in his own way. And if you look at the body of his work, you look at a film like Antonioni's The Passenger, he gives a very small, moderated, realistic, almost flat performance in that film, which is quite different than what we think of him when we think of him in The Shining and The Joker, where he's so exaggerated. And he talks about having created a way of working for himself that uses multiple acting techniques. And it always has to be sort of through your own lens of what works. Go
I'm
to
going to
good
throw a
acting teachers like Milton.
and Sharon. All right, I'm going to throw a slight fly in the ointment here. And the reason is a lot of times I think acting teachers sound like they make sense, and it makes sense. You're you're kind of, if it makes sense to you. I think it takes a long time to figure out what makes sense. I mean, I have to say,
Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't.
well, also, and
I
I
mean, the
have to
first
say,
time
look,
I walked into an acting class in New York and somebody told me to take off my clothes and do an imaginary shower, I knew that was not acting for me. I didn't have to work at it to figure it out.
well, I have to tell you, I didn't. I went to college with Kathy Bates, and many years ago we had dinner together, and she looked at me and she said, "Can you believe we've had careers considering the training we got?" And I'm telling you, the final exam at the first
Right.
year was taking an imaginary shower, and it just, I didn't know how to do it, but I didn't. It was difficult to figure out. It was not my problem, but I also think we have a difficulty because I'm not sure how much experience people have with what is good acting.
Well,
I mean, it's
yeah.
difficult for you, and I mean, it's different for you and me. I grew up during the '60s, '70s, and '80s. I probably think seen 2,000 Broadway plays, and you get a sense of it. Now we have a very limited idea of what is good acting, and I think it's difficult for actors to be, I don't know the answer to the problem. I think it's difficult for actors to know what it is they're trying to aspire to when, people are saying, "Oh my God, there was a guy that played Elvis. He was so good." Well, was he that good? It's like,
Yes. No, I,
I
I
mean, so,
agree with you. Sometimes we have to give every technique that feels that it makes sense to us enough time to work it out. I mean, some people believe that you shouldn't have multiple techniques, that you should embrace one and study it for 20 years so you can master it.
well, I have to say, I happen to be one of those people, and it's borderline. I don't think you have to do it for 20 years. I think it's very confusing.
Hmm.
I mean, I think it's very confusing, and as a result, if you're shopping, and if you're saying, "Oh well, I'll take a little bit from Uda, I'll take a little bit from Lee, I'll take a little bit from Stella, a little bit from Sandy," it may be too much.
Mm.
This was an exaggeration on Stella's part. However, she did say in class once, she said, "It may be that you can only learn one thing a year." And I know she was exaggerating to make a point, but if you look at some basics, which is really why I'm drawn to Stanislavski, that there are very specific areas that you look at and you say there's a character and a place and they're doing an action. Okay, so I'm going to understand something specifically about building a character, and I'm going to, if I understand something specifically about building a character, I may be the only actor in my age group that knows that. I mean, it's because if I'm working on character and working on living in the place, and I'm working on playing an action, if I'm working on so many things, my
Mm.
God, it's so much information, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I do think our kind of, and it's particularly American, I think, our American need to get everything really fast is very difficult.
Hmm.
I mean, although somebody told me it doesn't exist so much in England the way it did, but I was watching a documentary on Peter O'Toole, and he went to drama school, and then he did 4 years in Manchester or something. And I thought, that's how you become an actor. It's like you go to drama school and then you do 4 years. And of course, I always say to my actors, say yes to everything. Do every student film, do every, reading, do everything, because in working with other people, you begin to figure out what's working.
Yes, and I agree with that. I think also that you never stop learning. Stanislavski used to say that sometimes after performing a role in repertory for 2 years, he would learn new things about the role. I mean, we never really ever stop learning. We have to start with some basics that work for us. And if this is in us, if it's in our blood that we want to act and that we must act, and that's all we can do with our lives, then at some point we go out there and we keep learning through the work with it that we do. And I do also see a trap sometimes in people hanging on to acting classes for too long. When I was in New York and I was at HB at that time, studying, there were a lot of people in the classes who never ever did anything outside of HB, but talked, but
I think I was
but
one
they
of those
were
people that,
but they were there, and because it made them feel like they were actors because they were in class all the time.
Well, there's something to be said for that. I just want to add one thing that, even when the training is quote unquote good, I mean, I went to NYU and I was at the Adler studio, and yet there were many different techniques
Yeah,
presented. And
right.
I did not have a process until I was 40, because I realized, even though I wasn't even acting full time anymore, I realized in my late 30s, holy shit, I don't know what I'm doing. I have instinct and I've learned this here and this here and this here. But when it comes down to it, it wasn't until I went and began taking Milton's class for years. And it enabled me to really develop, like for the very first time in my life, really develop a process and a confidence about, that's the thing, the confidence. And of course, the more I stayed, the further in depth it went. It wasn't that because I was in one system that was like a dead end road. It wasn't. It just
I do
kept
think
going deep.
I think that's an exciting part of it. I mean, I love that Sharon and I are both in our 50s, and we keep learning. I mean, it's just, I think that's the fun thing about it. I said in class not too long ago, I said, the guy I feel sorry for is my dentist. I mean, that's what he does every day. I mean, it's like, what does he go home at night say to his wife? How was your day? And he says, oh, yes, there was an old guy that came in and I gave him an implant. I mean, what
Well,
is
but there are
that?
dentists and dentists. I now have a new dentist because my old one retired. And it was like a breath of fresh air because I went to dental school. This guy gave me all this information and he
Ah,
loves what he does. If we love what we do,
yeah.
we're always going to be learning about it.
I do, but I do love the fact that I think if you can let go of the idea that you're going to get it,
Yeah.
and that that it will free you. I
You
think the
you
idea that you
start with
can
some
keep at it.
basics, you start with some ideas, and you keep developing them. And as you work, each thing that you do and each experience that you have adds to that, and you get deeper with what you go. I think really part of the problem with acting, and only relying upon yourself and pulling roles down to yourself and using personal substitution is that those are the people that might end up with careers where there was one huge role that was right for them for that moment, and then they aren't able to have a range and continue. I mean, I think in terms of somebody like an Elizabeth Taylor, who started out as a child star and morphed along her way and was able to play such a huge range of different classes, and other actors that I've known along the way who had one really big role and never really got another thing because they were sort of not able to change and morph over time. So, from my point of view, what I want to teach actors to do, which I believe you do, Melton, is to have a way in that allows them the imagination and the breath to go in all kinds of different places so that they can do characters in many different forms and many different types and have a career over the long run, and not just one great star role in your 20s or 30s, and that person's name is forever there with nothing else that happens to them. In my opinion, the idea is to keep acting as you change, as you age. And I used to be a dancer, and one of the things I think that is so much more wonderful about the profession of acting is that we can do it when we're old. As a dancer, forget it. I can't jump anymore. And I won't try.
No, no.
But to think in terms of a career that takes you into places that you could not have imagined when you were 20, in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, is a gift of art.
And I think that, God, that's such a good point, because it's the idea of not just getting a job, but really having a life. And I mean, we've seen it so many times. Really, really well-known actors who have this enormous desire to do a play, and they do a Broadway play, and they just can't do it. It's like they lost it in pursuit of whatever stardom. They lost the ability to work on it, on the idea, the technique ideas that they needed in order to play a vast variety of parts. I think it's important. I think finally it becomes unsatisfying.
Mm-hmm.
I did notice that, in fact, I already have a ticket, that Brian Cox is doing Long Day's Journey into Night, opening in May of 2024. And of course, he's made a fortune on Succession, and he's done all of this sort of thing. So now he's going to go do a part. And I will be interested to see how he does it. In the same way, I'll be interested to see how Jeremy Strong does Enemy of the People next year.
Yeah.
So Sarah Dixon would like you to speak on communion, which I'm not sure, I've not heard that term, but I'd love to hear you speak on it. And then also action and counteraction, which is, I know, something that you've talked about.
Right. Communion is sometimes translated in other translations of Stanislavski as communication. And the idea, and I think the first of all, I would say that goes back to Diderot. The idea of theater is to tell stories to audiences. The whole point is to bring audiences into the work you do, because that's what makes it an art and not psychotherapy or therapy or something else. It's a communication and a communion with the audience. As Diderot used to say, audiences go to the theater not to see you cry, but to have tears drawn from them from empathy. And so what Stanislavski means when he's talking about communion, it seems to me, is that we are communicating in a way with the audience such as we feel with the audience a shared humanity, a communion of shared humanity, that we are telling stories in order that we all understand all of what we experience as human beings better. So that's what I understand to be the role of communion in theater. Action and counteraction, for most of the system and most of Stanislavski's life, he taught that we needed to have actions. What do we do on the stage? And most of us encounter that easily in acting classes. And Milton is great at teaching this and teaching the need for being able to do something and to address a problem on a stage. But toward the end of his life, he realized that if all actors on a stage had only actions, there could be no scene that developed, because it's in the interaction that real drama lies, the interaction between people. So he created a new idea of action and counteraction. So from his late work, which is what my newest book is about, Active Analysis, actors are brought together to understand that there's someone in a scene who drives the scene and the interaction forward, but there's always someone in the scene who's pulling a resistance and who is counteracting that action forward. And it's in the connection between what one actor does and how another actor counters it that the interest in the drama really comes about. And the word counteraction is really important, because it's easy to say, oh, it could be a conflict. You're talking about conflict, Sharon. There's always conflict. But not every scene that is written has a clear conflict. If you're doing a love scene, if you're doing a scene of negotiation, if you're doing a scene that seems that atmosphere is primary, you may not have a conflict. Two people in a love scene want the same thing, but there's always going to be some way in which there's a resistance that develops, however subtle or however broad, that creates why the scene needs to continue, why it needs to go on, where is the point of the drama. And so in that sense of action meeting counteraction, this is where he went in his last 10 years of his life. What he called active analysis, because we're actively analyzing how a scene comes out of the communion between two people or more.
I also think, yes, I also think it's I'm just throwing this in because I think it's very interesting, because actors now, everybody is now doing self tapes, and they're doing self tapes mostly with readers. And it seems to me, when you were saying it, it's the necessity of being clear the action you're playing. It goes without saying, but the idea that you as an actor are aware of the counteraction gives you more to play. It almost gives you
Yes.
the
And
obstacle.
if you're working by yourself, which is what you're talking about in a self-tape,
Yeah,
you're almost working like a mime, aren't you? A mime who creates the wall. You see, if you a traditional mime artist who comes up and makes the wall by the way he uses his hands, and you, as you watch him, see both him working and the wall, that's what an artist working solo kind of needs to do, to create the action that is grounding them, but allows the audience to see what is the counteraction against which that action is
yeah.
pushing. You're absolutely right.
Yes, I think it's good. And I just wanted to get back to something you said before. I was shocked to hear the directors said, don't worry about the actions. I found When I really started teaching, early on, I started working with Kira Sedgwick, and she was 19, and I knew nothing. And so at one particular point, she said, "Let's." We would work, and then she'd go do the movie, and she'd call me on Sundays. This is back before FaceTime, and we had to use telephones. And we'd go through the scene she was doing. And at one point, she said, "Why don't we label every scene?" And it was so interesting because what we would do is, this is the scene where I let mom have it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like by accident. It's like we came upon the actions, and it was so interesting. And I thought it was like a great way, especially in film, because really in film, scenes are short and only one thing happens. There's a change, but only one thing happens. It's not like a play.
Mm-hmm.
And just being able to say, this is the scene where
Mm-hmm.
this is the scene where
Mm-hmm.
gave you something to hold on to. It gave you an impulse for the scene
Mm-hmm.
that was so much better than saying, what are the lines?
Mm-hmm.
Or forcing a performance at the beginning of it. But my God, I'd never leave it in the hands of the director. Well, especially now.
Mm-hmm.
So this is from Rochelle. I love this. She says, "Can you touch upon the difference between actors that have nuance and do every take differently versus a more calculated, I know what I'm doing, but it's all the same. Every take is the same."
Oh, I have a response to that. Stanislavski, especially toward the end of his life, said always this: plan what you're going to do, but never how you're going to do it, because how you're going to do it depends upon the partner you're working with. And I think that this question touches upon that notion, because when you say know what you're doing and do it the same is the tricky part, because every time you do anything, it's for the first time. And the illusion of the first time is huge. Even if you're going to do it the same, what is the same? You can't step into the same river twice. So when you focus on knowing what you're doing and allowing yourself to do it within the circumstances, I think that's how I might answer that question. Does that make sense to you, Milton?
Yeah, I just think that these are not the only two options. That every take is different, and every take is the same. Having spent my life also as a producer, the idea that I would end up in the editing room with every take different, I would go insane. I mean, because it really is then the editor is cobbling together a performance. So it so it's I think it is that you want to always keep it fresh. And I think it's one of the things an actor knows. I think I was working on a film years ago, and the actor loved the first take. The director loved the first take. Everything was, I mean, it was just it was amazing. And then when we went in for coverage, the second time he did it, he panicked because he was trying so hard to recreate what he did the first time. And so I just went up to him. I wasn't, of course, allowed to. And I just went up to him and I said, "Don't worry about what you did the last time. Just play the action of the scene."
Yeah, that's exactly the point, Milton.
Yeah, and
Because
that
if
was
you
what
start worrying about doing it the same, you're putting your attention in the wrong place. You're not doing the work of the scene. You're doing a different scene. You're trying to remember what you did last time.
And also, I always think that's a note for callbacks. And, the callback, they say, "Oh, and they loved what you did. Do it exactly the same." Which they don't know what that is. And so, of course, you don't do it the same. What you do is play the action of the scene fully, and it will always grow.
That's exactly right.
So we have 2 minutes left. Would you like to take one more question?
Sure.
Why not? All right.
I'm looking at the chat too, and there's a lot of great stuff on there. We just don't have enough time for
I
everything,
know.
right?
I know.
I guess we'll have to do this again.
Exactly. So I encountered this misconception over Facebook, which is where both Milton and I seem to get into arguments that are completely futile. But someone was referring to Stella, who talked about the importance of actors having size and raising themselves up to the size of the idea that acting is out. This person was referring to a performance, a recent performance in Oliver, the kid. And the disconnect was, I thought, he alluded to all of this and then said, so yes, go big, go bold, ham it up. And I thought, oh shit.
I never think that works. I mean, I have to say, it's too weird. I saw that performance of Oliver, and I liked it. I also saw the original, and it wasn't as good as the original. But you know, I also have been around forever and have seen some great musical theater performances. I mean, just great musical theater performances. So I don't think it has to be big and flashy. When Stella was talking about size, she was talking about inner size. And she was talking about the actor understanding how big the idea of these plays are. I think in Stella's mind, religion didn't work. And so therefore, what did work was the theater. And it worked because there were human beings on stage who had problems that were like my problems. And so therefore, if they understood the depths of those problems, that we watched people struggling. And that's what made it interesting. And so I think that's why, Stella had a comment once that because of Chekhov, we had to have Stanislavski. And it was because there were human beings on stage for the first time. I mean, it's like we were watching human beings in circumstances. And therefore, we needed to understand how big that was as an actor. I remember her saying to an actress once, darling, who was working on Doll's House, and she said, darling, this is one of the most difficult things in human history. Personal freedom. You're playing it like you're talking about a sale at Bloomingdale's. And she wanted us to come up to the size of that idea.
I didn't see that, Oliver, but I have a slightly different take on the question, Walker, if I might go there.
Yeah.
And I don't think this is different from what you're saying. I think it's just a different take entirely because of I'm reacting to the word size. Because one of the things that I've really learned about going from stage to film is that an actor has to really learn to adjust the means of their expression to the frame that they're in. So if you're on a Broadway stage framed by a proscenium arch, and your performance has to carry all the way back to the last row of the highest balcony, or if you're on even a bigger stage than a Broadway stage, you have to really expend the energy and direct your energy of performance all the way to the depths. But when you get on film, the traditional way people talk about it is you just make everything small and you size it down. And in point of fact, what you're doing is something that your student Chris Petrovsky said last week on the Conversations of Acting. What you're doing is you're paying attention. This is part of experiencing a role. You're paying attention to how the frame that is putting your work out there has changed. If you're in a close-up, you have to adjust your means of expression to that close-up, and the size has to be taken into account. So you may be doing something as emotionally charged as you did on the stage, and you had to send your energy all the way back to the back wall, but now you have to send it to a camera that's no more than a foot away from your face. And so you don't reduce your energy. The emotional energy, the spiritual energy, the energy that's surging through your body is the same, but it is directed differently. It is sized to the conversation. You are in a conversation, a communion always with the people in the theater or the camera in front of you that is picking you up, and you are always talking in a way that adjusts to that audience. If I were talking to you in person, I would probably be talking a bit differently than I am today because I'm on this rest stream medium and addressing you with that in mind. And so I think of size as something that is about adjusting our energy to the given circumstances of the performance we're giving at the moment we're giving. It would be ludicrous to be in a musical theater, which I did as a kid a lot. It's where I started my career in theater, in a revival of Music Man, playing a 12-year-old when I was 26. And it would have been ludicrous for me not to be big and energetic and put everything that I was feeling about my character out there in the hugest sense of the way that I could, because people wouldn't see it. And if people don't see it, they can't be with you. And if you took that to the stuff of a film, a television camera, a camera, if you're doing a self-tape, you have to adjust that size or you're going to look phony. But you don't look phony in a theater. This was the problem with early film. Early film just put a camera up and it captured what actors were doing on Broadway. So if you look at an early film of Sarah Bernhardt or a silent film with John Barrymore, Drew's relative, right? They look huge. They look like they're overacting. They're not overacting. They're acting for a theater space. And so they're not overacting, they're adjusting their means. And now we've learned that we can change our cinematic language to adjust to that size. So that's my 2 cents on it, Milton.
Very good. Walker, why don't you join us so everybody can see who you are?
Okay.
Thank you, Rocker.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. There we go.
Thank you, Walker. Thank you all. Thank you, Sharon. This was fun.
Too short. It was short.
I know it was nice of us to take our phone conversations when you're driving to work and put them in front of people.
Yes, we do virtual carpooling
all the time. Anyway, thank you all for joining us. We will do this again. And, by all means, continue to send questions to Walker and we'll compile them and we'll get together again. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting, Walker.
My pleasure. Bye.
Bye.